Hello and welcome back to the Nasty Metal Production channel, great YouTube, and welcome to another album of the week. This is episode number 151, and today's episode is focused on the Number of the Beast, Iron Maiden's classic, most, well-beloved third full-length album. Originally released on March 22nd through EMI or Capitol Records, depending on EMI in Europe and Capitol in America in 1982. This was, of course, the album that, to a really much more of a wider audience, introduced the world to none other than the soaring melodic voice of Bruce Dickinson, who had prior, which I'll get into more of at least the connections between his previous band that he was in, Samson, and of course with Iron Maiden and so forth. And I've covered some of Samson's albums anyways on this channel before, but this is where everything starts to all of a sudden just come together. Basically, everything, like the whole two worlds begin to just collide. And this is where everything just concludes and stuff in terms of the story between Bruce Dickinson and Samson, and of course the whole beginning here with Iron Maiden. So let me just get it, because I'm gonna go through at least some of the history and everything prior to at least to release and the recordings of this classic Iron Maiden album, the album that basically made Iron Maiden superstars in a way. It made them a worldwide phenomenon that ended up really being expanded on with the next two albums after this one. So there's a whole lot to at least to unpack with this album. So let's just get right into it. So prior to, of course, to the recording of Number of the Beast, we have to also talk about the previous singer, that being, of course, Paul Di'Anno. By the end, at least by the time of 1981, after at least the release or the recording of Killers, and during that whole tour, obviously there was a lot of drug and alcohol issues, I believe, as well, with, of course, Paul Di'Anno, which he had at least brought up plenty of times in interviews. And he always tends to put himself the blame for why he didn't really last as long as he did with Iron Maiden, or why he didn't really get to really be more prominent during the rest of the years with Iron Maiden. And again, I'm going to read a quote from Paul Di'Anno that's at least on Wikipedia's page for Iron Maiden right here. So let me get through this as good as possible and read through it. So again, Paul Di'Anno was, of course, what was in interviews and everything, especially whatever this is taken from, was demonstrating, again, the increasingly self-destructive behavior, particularly, again, due to his drugs, which about Di'Anno comments right here. So let me read this as good as possible. Again, this is in his words. It wasn't just that I was snorting a bit of coke, though. I was just going for it nonstop, 24 hours a day, every day. The band had commitments piling up that went on for months, years, and I just couldn't see my way to the end of it. I knew I'd never last the whole tour. It was too much. So again, and with his whole performance and all of that just waning in, Di'Anno was given his walking papers following the Killer World Tour in 1981, or at least by the end of 1981. And at this point, Iron Maiden had already picked their replacement. This is where we have to now backtrack to, of course, to Samson at the very notorious concert that took place in September 12th of 1981, which, at least, 1981, that, of course, was recorded and was released physically for the first time, of course, in 1990. And this would have been the very last performance of Bruce Dickinson with this previous band, Samson. Now, before we really get into any more further with this, we have to also even more backtrack with at least the history between Samson and Iron Maiden, because of this won't be the first, nor was it this wasn't the first time. Actually, this was the last time, but the first time that there was a connection between Samson and Iron Maiden was actually on the album Head On, with, of course, with the instrumental track Thunderburst, which, of course, Steve Harris has writing credits on. Technically, Thunderburst ended up being re-recorded by Iron Maiden as, of course, as, well, The Ides of March. However, again, depending on who you ask, especially when it comes to at least if you to gather up old interviews of a Paul Sampson, he basically was a little bit peeved by what Steve Harris did with, of course, with the Ides of March and what he gave credits to. Because he gave credits to all himself for the Ides of March on Killers. However, on Thunderburst, for the song that was on Head On, Steve Harris at least got somewhat co-writing because of it was kind of a slight collaboration. Again, there's not a whole lot of clarification of stories or anything that really kind of gives you any sort of deep insight to the relationship that there kind of was between Paul Sampson and maybe the guys of Iron Maiden, especially Steve Harris, for example. So that's still always up for debate, but still, Thunderburst, of course, was released first because Head On was released in 1980. And, of course, Killers was released in 1981. But that was the first time, and the whole reading festival was the last time. But Steve Harris was not the one who went to the reading festival on September 12th of 1981. No, it was, of course, Iron Maiden's notorious manager, Rod Smallwood, who prior to at least to the time where the band at least took the stage, Bruce Dickinson was caught talking to Rod Smallwood at this show. So I was probably in the back or somewhere, and again, this is where everything all of a sudden started to take place. Now, of course, Bruce Dickinson has always talked about how he at least admired the work ethic and the writing and the whole style and everything of Iron Maiden. He always appreciated it. He always even said that again, with all due respect, even though we kind of at least somewhat dug at maybe a little bit of the raw power of, let's say, someone like Paul Di'Anno, but at the same time, musically, he just could feel that he could see himself singing these songs better. So that was always Bruce Dickinson's comments about Iron Maiden, and of course, this is where everything began, and that at least by November or December, Bruce Dickinson had, added some rehearsal at least rehearsal takes. It is basically him vocal takes over some of the more already pre-recorded songs from, like, Killers, then sent to, of course, Steve Harris to kind of give them an idea of who his voice would be over some of these Iron Maiden songs. And again, of course, I've got a bootleg download of this that I've downloaded years ago. And this is where everything just began. And so, from there on out, from into 1982, Bruce Dickinson was the definitive replacement for Paul Di'Anno and Iron Maiden, and I guess did plenty of shows with them to kind of test everything, but for the most part, from January to February of 1982 at Battery Studios in London is where, of course, the late, great Martin Birch was... The whole recording sessions for the sound basically took place. And on March 22nd of 1982, this album finally gets released upon the entire world. And I guess you can say the world was mesmerized because he just became the more beloved, more permanent guy. Of course, nowadays you now have that group of people that will go, well, Paul Di'Anno was better. You know, you always have that. You have that crowd now. Kind of a similar thing with, of course, between Bon Scott and Brian Johnson, both of them, again, of AC/DC. Still, though, when it comes to Iron Maiden, I think you tend to see more Bruce Dickinson fans, but still see plenty of Paul Di'Anno fans who will ride or die with the Paul Di'Anno era. Me, I enjoyed both eras to begin with. So, and of course, Paul Di'Anno was not really the first Iron Maiden singer to begin with. He was just the first one to really kind of make it a much more better splash because of the exposure we had with the actual full albums than compared to any of the ones previously that it sang with Iron Maiden, like again Palmer Day and such and such. So without further ado, let me just let's run through these songs right here on, of course, Number the Beast. So for the most part, for most of the majority of the releases from either EMI and Capitol throughout the Europe and into America or North America, Canada, and so on, this album only had 8 songs, whereas I'll get into the Japanese pressings, which included another track onto the album, which would then make it 9 songs. I'll get into that, but first let me run through at least the original 8 songs for, of course, the classic here, The Number of the Beast, which are, of course, Invaders, Children of the Damned, The Prisoner, 22 Acacia Avenue, the title track, Run to the Hills, Gangland, finally ending with Hallowed Be Thy Name, which I might briefly talk about its sort of history, as especially during recent times. So, but that's at least is your original 8 songs for, of course, the album. However, when it came to the Japanese pressing for this album, there was another track that was added onto it, which would then make it 9 songs. That would be the song Total Eclipse, which on the original Japanese pressings of the album, Total Eclipse was actually put in the middle between Run to the Hills and Gangland. However, on the more recent, some of the more later, mostly the 90s remasters of the album, Total Eclipse was somewhat switched and was put in the middle between Gangland and Hallowed Be Thy Name. So that was kind of interesting. But on most of the original Japanese pressings for, of course, The Number of the Beast, Total Eclipse was put again in the middle between Run to the Hills and Gangland. So there we go. But again, just with the original 8 songs, it all clocked in at least at 39 minutes and 11 seconds. But with the song Total Eclipse being added into the actual album, which let me kind of pull up at least the 1998 remaster, which where I can get the proper time length for this one, because with Total Eclipse added into it, it went from being 39 minutes to at least to 44 minutes. So there it is, at least over 44 minutes. So really with Total Eclipse, it really kind of lengthened the album a little bit more. But again, Total Eclipse is, I think, a fantastic song in its own right. But I'll get into more of that. So that's it. There's all the songs that was released for The Number of the Beast. Of course, we can always gonna even talk about at least some of the singles for the album that came in the wake of course, this classic album right here. Again, Run to the Hills being one of the first singles for this one, was released in February 12th of 1982, and of course, Total Eclipse was actually the B-side. So this was, I think, the first time anyone outside of Japan actually got to hear Total Eclipse. Was a part of the Run to the Hills single. However, Number of the Beast, the title track itself, was actually the second single release, and of course, the B-side was Remember Tomorrow, which was actually a live version that was recorded in October 29th of 1981, and of course the Palsport San Lazzaro in Palo, Italy, or Pada, Italy. I fucked all that up. I'm a disgrace to, of course, Italians, which again, I'm half. I got at least Italian in my blood to begin with, so I'm a complete embarrassment. Okay, but there it is. There was at least was 2 7-inches for at least, or 2 singles that came in the wake of Number of the Beast. One released prior to the album and one released after the album. So there it is. So, where do I really begin with, of course, Number of the Beast? Well, I can just go on about how just my experiences of living with this album for at least close to a decade now. I have lived with Number of the Beast. Actually, close to 2 decades, because the first time was I was still living down in Fresno. I was still very little, And I just remember my brother borrowing this album from, of course, the library, because prior to that, the only Iron Maiden song that I ever heard for the very first time was 2 Minutes to Midnight as part of the Grand Theft Auto Vice City in-game soundtrack, as a part of the V-Rock station in that game, which featured a lot of 80s sort of hard rock, heavy metal, even at times of slight thrash metal bands that was included in that soundtrack. That's how I was introduced to some of the other bands that I never knew about, and Iron Maiden was one of those. So again, prior to that, I was being introduced to Judas Priest, but it was with the Vice City game that I got introduced to Iron Maiden. And then after that, my brother, of course, ended up buying what was still at the time the more recent album, that being, of course, Brave New World. And of course, the Dance of Death was then becoming a brand new album that very year too, in 2003. But it's still, my brother went and bought Brave New World, and of course that compilation album that came out within the 90s. So it was around the time when Blaze Bayley was the singer for Iron Maiden. That was Best of the Beast, which then, of course, had songs off Number of the Beast, that being, of course, the title track and Run to the Hills. So that was the first time I actually ever heard those songs begin with, prior to, of course, hearing the album itself. I mean, the song Number of the Beast actually opened up the Best of the Beast compilation. So that was really the first time I ever heard it, and it was one of those, again, the iconic intro and everything.
Woe to you of earth and sea, for the devil sends the beast with wrath, because he knows the time is short. Let him who hath understanding reckon the number of the beast, for it is a human number. Its number is 666.
But yeah, that intro was, again, the most memorable fucking intro I'd ever heard. And again, talk about for this little young kid at the time in the mid-2000s, just somehow being mesmerized by this intro before it just goes into one of the more, again, very upbeat, very fast, almost kind of, again, a little bit punkish type of rhythm and pacing to it. I know some would say are going to scoff at that, but this is where I think where at least some of the feel of the classic sort of Di'Anno era Iron Maiden sound was still at least kind of crept in some of the sounds of this album right here. But still, that's where I ended up becoming a slight fan and just so much interested in Iron Maiden from there on. And then, of course, my brother then finally borrowing Number of the Beast from the library, and I ended up become a fan of plenty of other songs I think were just as good, if not at times maybe even better than some of the actual songs themselves. I mean, come on. Children of the Damned, The Prisoner, 22 Acacia Avenue, Gangland, which I know there are some people I know that seen the shit on this song, but I always loved it. It's a very, very much more of your classic new wave or British heavy metal, speed metal-like song. This is kind of the typical of that era, because again, Iron Maiden were one of the stalwarts and one of the mainstays and the big heavyweights of the sort of new wave or British heavy metal movement, and of course then Hallowed Be Thy Name, which at the time, it was one of those songs I really had to really get into. I wasn't, again, so enamored by it first time, but over years, it has grown on me, and I think it's a very well put together track. So there we go. However, I do have to bring up Total Eclipse, which was never really meant to be on the original album, but did end up being added on to, like, firstly, the Japanese pressings for this album, and of course, then later, the more reissues of the album, like, again, the CD reissues and so on. And that song became an instant favorite early on in my life. And to me, it just, every time I went back to this album, there was always some brand new thing that I ended up enjoying about it. And what a album. Also, again, the one thing that always was very interesting about Iron Maiden and really caught to me at the time was the lyrics. Compared to every other heavy metal band at the time, they really kind of cared about putting stories into songs and really kind of really focused on that. So it was like one of the main focuses for the writing was stories. I mean, it was always like that early on, especially in the Killers when you're doing like a song like Murders in the Rue Morgue and taking inspiration from like Edgar Allan Poe. But with this one, it's kind of a similar thing. You're taking either some, at least somewhat, lyrics or inspiration from at least, let's say, like literature or, of course, religious literature and so on, and just putting it to at least songs without trying to be overly Christian and outward. And that's with, of course, the title track, because it had nothing to do with at least being satanic. It had more to do without at least a story or something. It had more of, it was like the accounts of, is this real or is this fantasy? You know, again, what is real and what is not real? Again, is this a dream or is this, again, just reality? It's just questioning that. That is more so what was the whole themes of Number of the Beast, was because of, was more so built around, is this real? Am I seeing, is it fake? Am I dreaming this? That was the whole thing, the whole topics and the overall themes with the song. And again, with the just like with everyone during this whole satanic panic era and what you still get now with certain idiots on YouTube, they'll try and spin the song in their own way and think that it's worshiping the devil when it's not. And whatever. The same thing, let's say, like the themes for 22 Acacia Avenue. They're not glorifying prostitution, but it's actually talking about the depravity of it and how wrong it is. So it's not that they are worshiping it or glorifying it. It's more so it's them in their best way that they can on of basically damning it and whatnot, of again of just the whole idea and everything about wrong, everything about what is prostitution. So that's what the themes were, and some people again tried to think they were glorifying it when it really wasn't glorifying prostitution in the song of 22 Acacia Avenue, especially when who they're talking about and what they're trying to describe you of being very younger women, especially younger girls and whatnot, that are somehow we're getting caught up in that sort of idea, which again is still something today, especially if you're going into the ideas or of sex slavery and whatnot, especially with the underage girls and whatnot, and putting them up for sale and whatnot. And again, it all kind of falls in within that. Again, so the song for, again, the whole themes and everything for 22 Acacia Avenue is more so about the depravity of the whole thing and not really the glorification of it. So there we go. But there's so many other songs on here that I can talk about in its themes. I mean, Run of the Hills was more so about the issues between the Indians and, of course, the Americans, especially when they came, of course, with us coming on to their land and everything. Again, being of course, part Indian, it actually does kind of come across as very very true in some ways. So it's not that they're doing a song that's anti-Indian, but it definitely seems to be about the wrongful the history of us treating the Indians as badly as we did, and what we did to its children, what we did to its women, what we did to its men, and just overall, and by just taking the land away from them. And that's what the whole theme for Run to the Hills is really about. So it's a lot more like Thinking Man's kind of heavy metal with at least with the Number of the Beast. And that, of course, falls into a song like Hallowed Be Thy Name, which deals with at least with somebody who's on death row. And it is a very much a well put together song, no doubt. However, over time, this song really created a lot of controversy, and that was with, of course, with the members of the band Spirit, who ended up suing Iron Maiden for possibly ripping off one of their songs and even ripping off lyrics for them, like by basically copying their lyrics and placing it into at least the song Hallowed Be Thy Name, But of course, that all got somewhat, I guess, slightly resolved, and I guess Spirit does get somewhat royalties for at least the song. But Steve Harris said that he never really meant to really rip off the artist. He did it as a way, as I guess, inspiration. He meant it as more like a slight tribute in a way, but he didn't try to take anything away from them in terms of money and whatnot and financial stuff. So that's that. But all in all, there's really not a song on Number the Beast that I consider to be a bad song to begin with. It is definitely up there as one of my absolute favorites of Iron Maiden. Even during the Bruce Dickinson era, it definitely is one of my absolute favorite albums. So there we go. Again, I also have the one of the more recent record reissues of this album, and that BMG I released. So there we go. That's how it shows you. I pretty much have 2 copies of Iron Maiden's Number the Beast. Again, both on CD and on record. So there we go. But that's it. That's really as far as I really can go about as far as the themes and the topics for at least the Number the Beast. So all I can do is, before I close it out, gotta bring up some little other tidbits of information. After the release, and I guess during the whole tour and everything of course, Number the Beast, well, drummer Clive Burr would end out his time with Iron Maiden, because of Number the Beast marks the final studio album with Clive Burr on drums. And of course, it's the only album with him with having any writing credits. So there we go. Again, after this, I guess whatever happened, between Iron Maiden and the French hard rock band or heavy metal band Trust, they did a switcheroo, because Nico McBrain, who of course at one point in time was in the Canadian rockers band Pat Travers, he of course was in the band Trust, and at least recorded an album with them. But by the time of 1982, I guess if they did a tour or whatnot, I don't know how that all happened, but with Bruce Dickinson coming from Samson, being of course the other incidents of at least from one guy from coming from one band into the other, the difference between the Iron Maiden and Trust is that they traded members, because Nico McBrain ended up replacing Clive Burr in Iron Maiden, and of course Clive Burr would end up replacing Nico McBrain in Trust. So therefore, from there on, becoming a member of Trust, and Nico McBrain ended up becoming a member of Iron Maiden, and thus is history. So that's where we end things right now. Again, Number the Beast is pretty much seeing its 40th anniversary, because again, in just at least a day or two, it is going to see its 40th anniversary, which be, I guess by the time you actually are listening to this, Tuesday will mark its 40th anniversary, and therefore, this is why it just seems such a great idea on making this album and Album of the Week episode, because it is deserving of it. It's time to celebrate such a classic album that is the Number of the Beast. This is the album that, again, like I stated earlier, made them superstars. So there we go. I hope all of you enjoyed. Again, if you ever have any sort of fond memories of Number of the Beast, whether it be positive or negative, you can leave them in the comment section below. But if you've never listened to Number of the Beast, you've been living under a rock, and you have basically ignored everything that has been popular or mainstream. Because of it is definitely, at least if you're into heavy metal or any sort of, at least want to check out the more classic popular periods of Iron Maiden, it is not that difficult of an album to get a hold of. You can walk into your local record store and find yourself a copy of Number of the Beast. It shouldn't be that difficult to find, especially if you got somewhere like a FYE or a Rasputin near you. So with that, hope all of you enjoyed. This is Heavy Thrasher saying I'm out, and I'll see you all later. Take care, everyone.